This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's mineralware.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to talk about the latest oil and gas and mineral rights news for December of 2025. So we're hitting record just before Thanksgiving. Justin, holidays are upon us. This year has just flown by. We say that every year, but it's true.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And every year it seems like it goes faster, but there's been no lack of news this year for sure when it comes to oil and gas, both on oil prices and with the changes, the bills, a lot happening.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot happening. It's been a lot of geopolitical stuff that's been going on. We were talking that it's light news month. I put my hands in air quotes as I'm saying that from a mineral rights perspective. So things that are maybe specific to different states and case law and things like that. But there's always things going on that side of things. But the big stories I think this month are related to the geopolitical side of things and the import and export and supply and demand. And so we're going to dive into that. There's some really interesting articles about some developments that have happened here in the past week or so related to major oil and gas producers. And then, what is that going to mean for the oil and gas prices, next year and beyond? And of course, we talked about this in detail just a couple of episodes ago. So be sure to go back and listen to episode 307, where we talk about the price of oil, given some forecasts that came out recently that projected oil that could fall below $50 in 2026. We talked about our take on that. And then the real, bright story around oil and gas has been natural gas, and their demand is going through the roof. And we talk about that in episode 306 as far as AI and power generation for data centers and all of that. And, what that's going to mean for natural gas prices, in the next year or two. And so this is sort of a footnote to that and a little bit of an update related to what's been going on lately about oil and gas prices. So, Justin, you want to read this first one here?
So our first article here is about Freeport LNG. And the article talks about the natural gas company Freeport LNG's export plant in Texas was on track to take in more natural gas on Friday, and a sign that one of its 3 liquefaction trains had returned to service after shutting down on Thursday. Freeport's one of the world's most closely watched U.S. liquid natural gas export plants, and its changes in operations have caused price swings in global gas markets in the past. And Matt, the LSEG said gas flows to Freeport were on track to reach 1.9 billion cubic feet per day on Friday, up from 1.3 billion cubic feet on Thursday. That compares with an average of 1.9 billion cubic feet over the prior 7 days. So, Matt, this is good news for the availability of natural gas. And it's kind of, on the other side, future prices in the U.S. declined about 2% on Thursday, due in part to the Freeport outage. So this is really good news for ensuring, low, consistent supply of natural gas for these data centers, for homes, for heating, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Europe and Asia rely heavily on U.S. exports of LNG. And so, yeah, that doesn't surprise me, I guess, that a major facility like that Freeport facility, if it goes out, then that can have an impact on the global gas markets. It's crazy to think, though, that one facility can cause the prices to drop 2%. And effectively, that's kind of what the makeup is. So the capacity is 2.4 BCF per day, where it can take natural gas, turn it into LNG for export. And that is, I guess, about 2% of our total production is represented there. And so, yeah, I guess it makes sense that you'd have U.S. gas prices drop 2% if this thing goes offline, because that's basically 2% of the U.S. demand, disappearing overnight if this facility goes down, for example. So, yeah, very interesting to see how big of an impact these large LNG export facilities have on natural gas prices. And like we've talked about, and as we mentioned in that natural gas episode, as more and more of these facilities get built, that's additional demand that's basically there for exporting natural gas and taking advantage of that arbitrage opportunity, because natural gas prices have averaged above $10 per MCF in Europe and Asia. And so if we can put it on a tanker, send it over there and get $10 for it, and companies are looking at that as a big opportunity, and that's why they're building these plants. So
You said it, man. Even back in the Biden administration, we were talking about how, this was something that we've known for many years, and it was always kind of a roadblock to being able to do more exports of natural gas. So it'll be interesting to see as these plants come online. As you can imagine, it's no small feat to build one of these. So I'm sure we'll hear about it. Our next article here, Matt, is really what all the mineral owners that we talk to are talking about for 2026. And that is that oil prices being depressed for a long period of time. And this article talks about oil prices sinking as Ukraine agrees to a peace deal. So the West Texas Intermediate price dropped below 60 per barrel, and really has to do with the peace deal that may be coming from the U.S. with Ukraine and Russia. And the agreement, which still has minor details to be sorted out, was confirmed. And it'll be interesting to see, what this does as far as it might ease sanctions on Russia's energy exports. And that could create an oversupply in the oil market when we already are kind of in a situation to where there's too much supply and not enough demand. And JP Morgan is forecasting Brent crude oil to dip into the $30 per barrel range by 2027 if the oversupply situation continues. Goldman Sachs has a similar prediction that West Texas Intermediate crude will average 53 per barrel in 2026. And that's similar to the latest EIA forecast, which I believe that was the forecast we talked about in our previous episode, man.
yeah, they've revised it. So I think in our previous episode, they had just issued, at that time, I think it was the September, or maybe it was the October update. But in any case, it was like $48 a barrel. And then they revised it again. I think it was around 52 for 2026. And so, Goldman Sachs is kind of in line with that latest EIA forecast, to your point. So, yeah, it's certainly, the consensus is, what the number is, nobody knows, but the consensus is that it's going to be lower than it is today because supply exceeds demand. And, macroeconomics 101, that's kind of the, what you end up dealing with is prices go down as you have an oversupply situation. And then, this kind of boom bust cycle that we always deal with oil and gas is, as prices dip, operators will stop drilling because it's not economic to drill at the lower prices. And then, demand is still kind of continually, flat, or at least going up slowly. And so what happens is once that demand, matches supply and then starts going above supply, then you have the prices go up again. And so it's this kind of sinusoidal wave of up and down, oil prices that we've seen for, ever since it's been tracked, basically. But it's certainly, I guess we're not immune to it, despite the changes that have been made to the systems in place in terms of the U.S. being, a large portion of the global supply equation. In the past, it's been very much OPEC, and then OPEC, deciding to, maybe for political reasons or whatever, they might put the hurt on U.S. producers and stuff like that. And that would have a big effect if they said, okay, we're just going to start pumping more oil, even though prices are low and demand isn't there. And certainly they can do that, and it will affect the price of oil still. But, the U.S. has a bigger role to play. And that's it's going to be interesting to see what happens as, if this all plays out, what they're going to do in terms of companies' capital budgets and drilling. And, certainly we'll see a little bit of a pullback, I think, but it'll be interesting to see what the extent of it will be.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And for the average consumer, the lower prices may reflect at the pump, and that may be a political win. But it'll be interesting to see, how long that lasts. And as we always say, there's so many geopolitical things that can impact this price. So we'll just have to kind of keep our finger on the pulse and see what happens throughout 2026.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this last one here is related to oil again, and this is around Venezuela. So Venezuela, even though it only exports, I think around 1 million barrels per day was the statistic that I saw, they have the largest known reserves of oil. The U.S. recently said, with President Trump coming out publicly saying that they were going to ramp up pressure on the Maduro government using covert operations, looking to potentially overthrow Maduro. Human rights groups are condemning the U.S. and some airstrikes as illegal extrajudicial killings. And so even more controversy, and, all of this kind of stems with the cartels and the gangs down there and the drug trade. And so President Trump has declared war on the cartels and trying to stem the flow of drugs into the United States. And Venezuela is the next country in the crosshairs here.
You said it, Matt, and I've had a lot of folks ask what's going on in Venezuela. It must be oil related. You hear that a lot in the news. And we were talking a bit before we hit record in that there's so many aspects to this. It's really hard to say that this is absolutely oil related, but they have a ton of oil. So 303 million barrels as of 2023, the home of the largest known reserves. And to put it in perspective, Saudi Arabia ranks second with 267.2 billion barrels and Iran at 208.6 billion barrels. So, Matt, I can see why people think that, but it'll be really interesting to see how much we really take advantage of that. There's been American companies that have been in Venezuela, but there were U.S. sanctions under the previous Trump administration that stopped exports to the United States. So who knows what's going to happen here?
Yeah, and it's interesting because they had just recently allowed Chevron to start producing oil again in Venezuela. And so now we're kind of going back and I think putting the crosshairs on Venezuela. So it was, to your point, something where they had basically totally stopped buying any Venezuelan crude and banned U.S. companies from operating there. That sort of changed a little bit. They weren't up to full capacity, but I think they were producing, Chevron was back to producing a good percentage of their full, 100% capacity there. And so, certainly this is all political, understanding what the motivation is behind it. To your point, Justin, I hadn't really thought of the long-term oil play. I did think it was more of a political move. And, the U.S. has a history of trying to intervene and overthrow governments, whether it's been overt or covert. It's been a part of our history, a kind of maybe a little bit of not the greatest part of our history, but it is something that has happened. So I suppose it's in line with that theme to be coming out publicly. I'm kind of surprised that they are being so public about it. But, with the entire buildup there, in the Caribbean with U.S. Navy and all the aircraft carriers and, all of that, they're saying that it's focused on counter narcotics operations, even though you could argue that you don't need a full carrier group to do that. It's a pretty kind of a small play if you're doing that in these little kind of guerrilla type warfare situations. But, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out and, what the political ramifications will be and, what that'll mean for access to Venezuelan crude. If that's the long game, like you said, to get access to that 303 billion barrels of oil. Because I was kind of surprised. There's an article that we'll link to in the show notes that talks about the different, top, I think, 5 countries by known oil reserves. And I was surprised the U.S. wasn't higher up in that list. We're the largest producer, but we only have 55 billion barrels, 55 billion barrels of oil and as far as known reserves. So that means Venezuela's reserves are more than 5 times, almost 6 times larger than our known oil and gas reserves. So yeah, maybe it is something where they're looking to get access to have a friendly government in Venezuela that will give access to U.S. producers to those reserves.
You said it, Matt, and that's something that I think, too, that's worth understanding is that really we would need an administration there that would allow us to come in and work with them because we would need to process this most likely in Venezuela. It wouldn't be economical to pump this out, put it on a ship unprocessed because it is that heavy crude that can be hard to deal with. So infrastructure will be important, and the easiest way to achieve that is to have an administration there that is favorable to you.
Yeah, for sure. And then, we need a lot of heavy crude oil. It's interesting because the U.S. has increased our production and it's been a lot of light, sweet crude. And because back in the day before the shale revolution, all these refineries that were built were designed to process oil that we imported. And the cheapest grade of oil is the heavy oil. And so we have a lot of Mayan crude, which comes from Mexico, that would go into large refineries on the Gulf Coast. that they would blend with some of the light sweet crude that the U.S. produced. And now with this glut of light sweet crude, we need heavy oil to blend in there to make sure that the grade of crude oil going into these refineries is such that it meets the design specifications, because they have to have a certain percentage of those heavy ends and all the junk that's in there with the heavy oil, the asphaltenes and things like that, because that's what these refineries are designed to refine. And so there is maybe an element of that, of getting something in the Americas, that we would have more access to oil. Certainly there's a diplomatic route that, if you think about it, from Venezuela and Mexico's two large heavy oil producers, that, we would certainly want to be on favorable terms with them to get access to that oil. And doing what President Trump is doing is not along the lines of trying to go the diplomatic route per se, even though maybe it is, but maybe it's a more direct way of saying, well, we're going to have military intervention on the cartels, and as a result, if you don't help us out, then we're going to cause some political issues for you, or economic issues. And so all of that, I think, is, in my mind, maybe less so related to oil and more so related to the drug side of things. Although I've read some skeptical articles, or articles that are skeptical of that angle. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. And ultimately, I don't know that because that Venezuelan crude is almost basically off the market now. Any further sanctions or military operations in Venezuela, I'm not sure that they're going to have a material impact on oil prices as much as the Russia deal, because Russia is a much larger exporter of crude oil. So it may have a short-term impact, as some of that oil gets taken off of the secondary market or the black market where it's being sold. But I'm not sure that it's going to have as lasting of an impact as the Russia deal with Ukraine. So.
Yeah, you said it, man. Russia certainly has the infrastructure to get it to market faster. All right, Matt. So rig count. Not a whole lot of news here. Looks like we lost a unit in Alaska, lost a unit in Louisiana, gained one in New Mexico, lost one in North Dakota, gained one in Oklahoma and Pennsylvania. Texas stayed flat, Utah stayed flat, and Wyoming gained 3.
Yeah, this is interesting because we gained 6 rigs total as far as land rigs are concerned. So that was kind of a surprise, actually, to me, because of what the price of oil has been doing. So I think, again, this just kind of reflects the end of year, probably, hey, we have a little bit of money left over in our capital budget. We need to spend it. Let's get these wellbores drilled before the end of the year. So I think that's probably what it is. I don't know that it's going to be like a lasting six rigs. I think maybe for the next 3-4 weeks, we'll see that situation. And then I wouldn't be surprised at all if by January 1st, they drop those additional rigs. But Wyoming gained 3. And unfortunately, this Baker Hughes rig count doesn't have insight into the Powder River Basin. We'll have to do some research on our own to kind of see what's been going on there. But I imagine that those 3 additional rigs are going to the Powder. And so that's 15 total rigs in Wyoming now. But yeah, the Permian still 254 rigs total. So they're by far the largest as far as activity. Eagle Ford is second at 41 right now. Third is the Williston Basin, so that's Bakken, North Dakota. And then Marcellus has been pretty strong. It's 24 rigs right now versus 25 a year ago, so it's been pretty steady. Haynesville has been really seeing a little bit more activity this year than a year ago. So we're at 41 rigs in the Haynesville, and that's both Louisiana and East Texas. And then a year ago, we were at 30. So a little bit of a shift to natural gas. It's certainly like we've been predicting and talking about. I think we're seeing that play out. And I think any shifting of rig counts is going to be from oil to gas, certainly if things keep moving in the direction they're headed.
Yep, you said it, Matt. And, as we always talk about, this impact will come in seeing less drilling over the next budget cycle, and then probably even less production or less new drilling over the next year. It's not 2026, but 2027 if 2026 is a really depressed year. So it's kind of a lagging indicator.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's kind of tying it back to that supply and demand situation. That's why it takes so long for these things to sort of move, like they do. You would think, okay, well, the U.S. can stop drilling very quickly. Well, these companies have those capital budget cycles like Justin mentioned, so they're planning out a year and ahead, and they're adjusting it quarter by quarter, but they don't they don't just totally stop spending money. Generally speaking, I guess if oil was like $1 a barrel, they might, but barring that, I think it's even during that COVID craziness with negative oil. They still were drilling. They just were not completing the wells and turning them on until the price is recovered. So yeah, it'll be interesting to watch that planning cycle. And I think that's a very good point, Justin, that if prices play out like they're talking, that you'd see kind of that delay in responding, once prices do start recovering, there's that kind of lag, at least a quarter, where they have to go through and do the planning and figure out, okay, what if we added a rig here? Let's do the scenario planning. What do the economics look like? Do we have the cash flow to support that? And that's the tricky part, that you need oil prices to be high enough for a long enough period of time that you have that extra cash flow coming in that you say, hey, we got to go spend this money. So it can't happen overnight. So it's going to be at least a quarter, maybe 2 quarters before then they can deploy that capital to drill more wells. So I think that's a really good insight.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, Matt. And, I'm glad that the oil companies are doing it this way and are being responsible, because it really helps the security of jobs for folks. We all know the oil industry is a boom and bust industry. So if they plan properly, manage their budgets well, everybody's more secure.
Absolutely. Well, and, speaking of boom and bust cycles and the key role that's in that whole thing are Landman. And I think there's a new season of Landman out, and I haven't watched it yet, but my wife and I have been talking about sitting down here one of these evenings and watching the next season. So if you haven't checked that show out, highly recommend it if you want to learn more about, it's very overly dramatized, but it's a fun watch for sure if you're interested in the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, no, it's very good, Matt. It's definitely worth the watch and very entertaining.
Absolutely. All right. Well, as you're getting with your families, and I hope you all have a happy Thanksgiving, or have had a happy Thanksgiving by the time this comes out, and having a nice holiday season. With that, we'll talk to you in the next episode. Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.